Hi guys, welcome back. Today, instead of going out to take photos or showing you some piece of gear, I'm actually going to show you how I've edited one of my photos. And I'll show you how I've taken this picture, which I'll put up right now, and turned it into this picture using both Lightroom and Photoshop. Inside Photoshop, you'll see that I use something called the TK panels. Full disclosure, they have not paid me to talk about it or promote it in any way. It's a panel I've been using for about a year now, and I'll put a link to a description in it below as well if you guys wanted to check it out. There is a free version from someone else of the TK panels called Luminance by Greg Benz, which does most of what I use it for, but there's just a few extra functions in the TK panels that I like to use. That's why I was willing to pay for it. So what I'll do is I'll take you into Lightroom, where I always begin my edits, because I use Lightroom for its cataloging and organizing features and some global edits as well as graduated filters. And we'll take it into Photoshop, where I'll show you how I use the TK panels luminosity masks to finish the photo off, as well as my own bit of a twist on the Orton effect. So let's jump on the computer, go into Lightroom, and we'll start editing this picture. So here we are in Lightroom, and as you can see, I have not touched this picture in any way, shape, or form yet. This is raw, fresh out of the camera, exactly as I took it on the day. One thing I always like to do when I first look at a picture is I'll see if I should do a lens correction or not. And what I've done is up here on the left, you can see I've got Z lens correction as a preset that I created. I only put Z in there because that way it's always the last one, instead because I like to use these two to compare different presets that I created as well. All right, if you don't have this preset, you can scroll down here on the right side down to lens calibration, I think it's called, sorry, lens corrections. And if you want, you can remove chromatic aberration. I always do because I find it just sharpens the image a little bit more. And then you can hit enable profile corrections. And Lightroom, because they worked with Canon, Adobe knows that this was done on a Canon camera with a 24-105 f4, whatever lens it is I've got, f4 LIS USM. If I didn't want to go through with that option, let's just go right to the top here, since we're going to need that soon. I can always just hover my mouse over this preset and it'll show me exactly what would happen if I did apply those two options to it. So I do like to apply it, so let's apply it right now. And from here, I will use these two presets that I've created. I know that presets are always a bit of a touchy topic, in the sense that there's always a debate as to whether you should or shouldn't use a preset. I've got no beef with people wanting to use presets. I use them as a starting point. All right, if the only thing I'm not a fan of when it comes to presets is if you just click on it and that's it. I mean, if you add the preset to the photo and that's exactly how you want it to be, great. But I find most times if you use the preset as a starting point and then make further tweaks from there, depending on the image that you're trying to create, that's where a preset comes in handy, because it can save you a lot of time in your editing process. But let's jump back on the computer and let's keep editing this photo. Let's look at these two presets. This is a high contrast one. This is a low contrast one. You can see the high contrast one is, because there's more contrast, it is a little bit darker. But because I do want to lighten this photo quite a bit, as you can see, the foreground is very, very dark, as is the bridge. I'm going to choose the low contrast one. And I'll do a few global corrections first before I add in some graduated filters. So I'll just raise the shadows a bit, just so this part here is more visible. And I'll drop the highlights just so the sky isn't too bright as well. And then from here, let's just play around with the colors a little bit, because I want a bit more color in the sky. So I'll use the HSL color panel. If you want, you can just focus on hue, saturation, luminance. I like having all of it just sitting there, because that way it's easier for me to edit my photos. And the way I like to do it is, when you click this button, and you can click anywhere you want in the photo, and Lightroom will say like, okay, that's the colors we want to tweak. Then when you press and hold, if you see here the magenta slider on the right under saturation is moving left and right depending on how I move my mouse up and down. So I will do that to a few colors here and there, just to increase their saturation a little bit. And then I'll do the same with luminance as well, where if I bring up the luminance, it brightens it, but I want to darken this part of the sky a bit. So let's drop the luminance down. Let's say that's probably good right there when it comes to those colors. Now let's play around with the sky a little bit. So let's come up here to graduated filters. Because I'm just focused on the sky, I'm going to drag it down, and if you hold shift at the same time as you extend this, it keeps it perfectly horizontal. Then we'll come down here to range mask and luminance. Now there's two options here. You can click on this button that says show luminance mask and you can see it in red, or you press O on your keyboard and it has the same effect. But one thing I will do first is here down here you've got range, right? If you, a little trick I learned this, if you hold the Alt key on Windows or Option on Mac, click on that and as you drag it right, you'll see how it's going to adjust that graduated filter so it's just only on the brightest parts of the sky and not the buildings. A few of the clouds up there are a bit affected. So if I go back to and show this luminance mask, you'll see that it's not too bad, but there are a few tweaks that we can do still. So let's just play around with that a little bit more. Change the smoothness of your graduated filter to make sure, you know, whether you've got sharp or soft edges. If you want to see how it's affecting, do the same thing like I did with range, where you hold down the Alt or Option key, click on it, and then as you're holding down the mouse button, just drag it to the left and right, and it'll show you how it's going to affect it. So since I don't want the building or the bridge to be affected, I'm going to make it quite a hard border around those. Let's just make sure that this is still good. Yes, that's fine. Let's bring up the saturation a little bit more for the whole part of the sky. I would say that is probably close to done. Do I need to? Maybe a little bit of contrast. So that's it for the sky. So let's do a new one for the foreground. And instead of dragging down top to bottom, drag from the bottom to the up. And I'll do the same thing. I'll hold shift down so that way and make sure that everything is a perfectly horizontal line. Press O to see the mask itself, but we'll come back down here, go to luminance mask again, and I'll do the same thing, hold down shift, except this time because I want only the foreground to be affected, I'm going to start on this side and bring it back. And as you can see, the water is being deselected and only the foreground is selected. But let's, so there we go, that looks pretty good. And that's it. So that's the picture fin edited in Lightroom. Now, as you can see, I don't do too much. I try to do some edits in Lightroom, but I like to finish it off in Photoshop because I've got that TK panels. If you don't have it, use that Lumenzia one that I mentioned as well. I started with the Lumenzia one, but then because I saw how many other tools are available with the TK panels, that's why I changed from Lumenzia to TK. There was no other reason than that. There's nothing wrong with the Lumenzia one. If it's just for luminosity masks, it's a great tool and I do recommend it. And as with the TK panels, they're not sponsoring me to say this. This is just from my personal experience that I'm passing on to you. If I didn't like it, I wouldn't recommend it. It's that simple because I like to find things that make my workflow efficient. So if it's not going to help you out, or if I don't think it would, I should say, I would not recommend that you go and give it a go either. But let's jump back on the computer. Let's bring this photo into Photoshop and I'll show you how I finish it off in there. But to get this into Photoshop, let's right click on here, go edit in Adobe Photoshop. Because I've got Photoshop open, this should be pretty quick. There we go. Over here on the right, you can see this is one of the TK panels I've got. And over here, further on, this is the other TK panel, which has to do with the luminosity masks that I mentioned earlier as well. All right, so we're gonna focus most of our attention here for now. So to start with this guy, I'm gonna come up here to the lights panels, and I'll just see which one I like the most. And with these panels, they're very much the same as layer mask in Photoshop in that only the parts that are white will be affected by the adjustments I want to make. So this one's okay. Let's give this one a go. I'll come down here and let's do a curves layer on this. And I'll just tweak it a little bit. I always like to put a bit of an S-curve into these ones because I find it does help the image the most. So if I want to focus just here on this orange one, or on that sun, on that glow up there, let's try this. That's not too bad. Let's see what we can get out of here. If it's not going to work, I can always just delete this layer and it's not going to affect the rest of my image, but that does look pretty good. I'd say that's almost it for the sky actually. Now let's look at this foreground and the bridge. What can I tweak here? So here we are on the darks, where it's going to focus on the darkest parts of the image. I'm going to try and find something that really isolates. There we go. So this one really isolates the bridge and this foreground here and the surrounding environment as well. So let's do another curves mask on this one. Alright, as you can see, as I play around with this, you can see just how much it affects the image. So it's only got to be a subtle changes, or much better than massive changes. I'd say that's pretty good right there. Let's just do one more. It just feels like this image just needs one more little tweak to get it working properly. So you know what, let's try this one. You know what, let's get rid of this curves 3 layer and prefer what this one has done instead. Where it's added a little bit of darkness but not too much, but let's tweak that one a little bit. All of this is ready to go, I'd say. So what I'll do is I'm going to unlock this background, this padlock that's on the background layer. I'm going to select all of them, turn it into a group. If you want, you can name the group. It's completely up to you. Because I've only got one group in this instance, I'm not going to. But what I will do is I'll duplicate that group, and then I'm going to merge all of those into one image. And then I'm going to take it one step further, and I'm going to convert this into a smart object. Now you may be wondering why I did convert it to a smart object, and it's because when you do convert an image to a smart object, what it does is that one, you'll see it when I get to it, but every adjustment that you make isn't done to the layer itself. It's almost like a filter that's added on top of it, so you can always adjust what you've adjusted or delete it completely. Whereas if you didn't, and you'll see what I mean when I get to the origin effect side of it, that if I don't turn it into a smart object, I can't undo or adjust what I've done to the layer. It's fixed. The only way to fix it is to delete the layer and start it all over again, which isn't always the most effective option. Whereas if you change it to a smart object, you're allowed to, you have the ability to adjust what you've adjusted in a much easier way. Here we are. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a layer mask onto this smart object, because as you'll see, this is going to, when I finish playing with this mask, the whole layer is going to be duplicated, and you'll see the effects that I'll be talking about. So first, let's select this layer, and we'll come up here to the quick selection tool, and I'm going to select the whole sky. So we've got that selection. We'll now select the brush tool, make sure this is on black, because I just want to brush this out completely. As you can see, that's all nicely done. Alright, but they still need a few more tweaks. It's not the most perfect mask in the world, because for the purposes of this video, I just want to show you how I edit it. But at least you guys can have an idea of what I do when I do edit my photos. So now I'm going to take this layer, I'm going to duplicate it. Yep. Now I'm going to do Control I on the keyboard, or Command I if you're on a Mac, and it's going to inverse that layer mask. All right, and remember, anything white is revealed, anything black is concealed. So in this case, everything that's visible is what's going to be affected by the mask. All right, and here you can now layer these. So this one I'm going to call Sharpen, and this one I'm going to call Blur. So let's attack the Sharpen layer first. I'll come up here to Filter, go Sharpen, Smart Sharpen. 260% is normally what I like to keep it at. I'll scroll down so you can have a better idea of the difference it's going to make. So here, if we turn the preview off, you can see there's this minor difference in the sharpness that you're going to get out of this image. So I'll just hit OK and let this process. Now, if you wanted to take a look at the differences, let's zoom in a bit more. You can see without the sharpen, with the sharpen, it just provides a little bit more detail to all of the areas in the image. So that's without the sharpen, that's with the sharpen. You can see that pylon has a bit more detail to it. This wharf will have a bit more detail, it's a bit less blurry, as will these rocks in the foreground here. So now let's zoom out, give you full screen, and now we'll select the blur layer. So now we'll attack the blur layer. So first thing we'll do is we go up to Filter, and go to Blur and select the Gaussian blur. For the radius of the pixels, they always recommend doing the same. The radius should be the same number as whatever megapixels your camera sensor is. In my case, I've got a 30 megapixel sensor, so I put 30 here. If you've got 24, 24, and so on. So I'll hit OK. Right now, it does look a bit weird, but bear with me, everything will start making sense. If you can see here on the right, it's got these two smart filters underneath, which is why that's what you get when you make it a smart object. You get these options here, because I can now double click on that and it will open up the option for the Gaussian blur, and I can now modify it. Whereas if I didn't have it as a smart object, I wouldn't be able to do that. Let's go back up to filter. This part is going to look very strange once I'm done with it, but trust me, it's all going to make sense. So we'll take this one, and for the Orton effect, it's always a case where you're massively increasing the contrast, the vibrance, and the saturation. I've played around with different numbers, and I found if I apply 70 across the board for the type of images I like to do, that gets a great outcome. So contrast, I've moved to 70, vibrance and saturation are both at 70 as well. I'll hit OK, and now this looks like a mess. I'll be the first one to admit it. But what we'll do is, if you make sure this layer is selected, go up to opacity and change it from anywhere to 10 to 15%. Alright, because that way, if you're at a full out of 100, it looks very weird. If you're at 0, you can't see anything. But since you just want this to be a subtle change, between 10 and 15% is always a good one. So that's 12. And as you can see, this is with that filter, this is without. It provides just a little bit of extra color and lack of texture into the sky because you've applied that blur to it. So that's without the blur, that's with the blur, and that's it. That's the image. So that's the edited image finished now. So what I'll do is, what do you guys prefer, with or without the glasses? Let me know down below. Right, and if you have liked following this along, if you have stayed with me this far, I do thank you for it, and if you could give me a thumbs up, that would be greatly appreciated. But if you do have any questions about my editing process, the TK or the TK panel, how I use it, please let me know in the comments below. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And if you would like to see similar edits but with like exposure bracketing or focus stacking involved as well, let me know and I'll be happy to show you, to put something together that shows you guys how I edit those photos. And if you would like to make sure you stay up to date with anything that's coming up, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and make sure that little bell is selected, so that way you get a notification whenever a new video does come out as well. But I'll leave it there for now. I hope you've learned something out of this. If you do have any feedback regarding the image or the editing process, like a way I could speed it up, please let me know. We'd love to hear from you. But I'll leave it there for today before I ramble on too much, as I have a tendency to do. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Have a good evening.